Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely legendary reign of Isabella I of Castile, the queen who literally refused to change her underwear until she conquered the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. The woman who looked at a fractured collection of squabbling medieval kingdoms and said, "You know what? I'm going to turn this into a global empire while wearing the same undergarments for a decade." So before we get into the delicious madness of 15th century Spanish politics, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're into stories about royal hygiene choices that accidentally reshaped world history. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's wild seeing who joins these late night historical deep dives. Now settle in, maybe grab some wine, and let's talk about the queen who proved that sometimes the most ridiculous personal vows lead to the most extraordinary historical consequences. So, you think you could unite medieval Spain through sheer force of will and questionable laundry habits? Adorable. Like thinking you could negotiate with a hurricane before you could even comprehend the sheer audacity of what Isabella I of Castile accomplished. You had to understand what she was working with. Spain in the 15th century wasn't Spain at all. It was a collection of squabbling kingdoms, each convinced they were God's gift to the Iberian Peninsula, while simultaneously being about as unified as a bag of angry cats. Isabella didn't inherit a country. She inherited a geographical suggestion and a headache that would last 30 years. Picture this: you're a princess in 1451. Which sounds glamorous until you realize that being a princess in medieval Spain meant you were essentially a very expensive chess piece that everyone wanted to move around the board. Your brother is king, but he's got the political instincts of wet bread and the military prowess of a particularly nervous squirrel. Your other brother died, probably from something that today would be cured with a zeet pack and a good night's sleep. And you're expected to marry whoever will give your kingdom the best deal on imported salt or military protection. But Isabella had other plans. She looked at the marriage proposals streaming in from various European princes, each one more entitled and less appealing than the last, and decided to do something unprecedented. She chose her own husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, not because he was particularly handsome, though contemporary accounts suggest he wasn't entirely repulsive. Not because he was wealthy, though Aragon had its charms. She chose him because together, they could create something that had never existed: a unified Spain. This decision, made when she was barely 18, would reshape the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, she had to survive being a woman with opinions in the 15th century, which was roughly equivalent to being a unicorn at a skeptics' convention. The thing about medieval royal courts is that they were less like the elegant affairs you see in movies and more like a combination of a soap opera, a business conference, and a maximum security prison. Everyone was related to everyone else through a web of marriages so complex it required flowcharts. Everyone was plotting against everyone else, and the food was terrible. Isabella navigated this world with the skill of someone who understood that one wrong word could mean the difference between a crown and a convent. When her half-brother Henry IV died in 1474, Isabella didn't inherit the throne so much as she grabbed it with both hands and refused to let go. There was a small matter of a civil war to settle first. Her opponents supported Joanna la Beltraneja, Henry's supposed daughter, though whispers suggested that Joanna's parentage was about as legitimate as a $3 bill. The War of the Castilian Succession lasted 5 years and was precisely as bloody and expensive as you'd expect from a family dispute involving crowns and kingdoms. Isabella won, naturally, not through military genius, though she proved surprisingly competent at siege warfare, not through superior numbers, though Ferdinand's Aragonese forces certainly helped. She won because she understood something her opponents didn't. That being queen wasn't just about wearing a crown and looking regal. It was about creating a vision of what a kingdom could be, and then dragging everyone, kicking and screaming, toward that vision. And what was Isabella's vision? Unity. Not the warm, fuzzy kind where everyone holds hands and sings songs around a campfire. The brutal, practical kind where everyone follows the same laws, worships the same god, and pays taxes to the same treasury. She looked at Castile, with its fractious nobles and independent cities, and decided to turn it into something resembling a modern state. This required breaking a few eggs, and by eggs, we mean the traditional power structures that had governed Spain for centuries. The nobles, predictably, were not enthusiastic about this plan. They'd spent generations accumulating power, land, and the right to ignore royal authority whenever it suited them. Isabella's response was to systematically dismantle their independence. She revoked illegal land grants, destroyed unauthorized castles, and created the Santa Hermandad, a royal police force that answered directly to the crown. Imagine being a duke who'd spent decades acting like a king in your own domain, only to have a woman half your age show up with an army and inform you that those days were over. But Isabella's most audacious project wasn't political reorganization. It was religious unity. Medieval Spain was what we might today call multicultural. If multiculturalism involved three distinct religious communities living in varying states of cooperation and suspicion, Christians, Jews, and Muslims had coexisted in Iberia for centuries, creating a unique civilization that produced remarkable advances in philosophy, science, and art. Isabella looked at this arrangement and saw not diversity but division. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 wasn't just about religious orthodoxy. It was about creating a unified Spanish identity. Jews and Muslims weren't just following different faiths, they represented alternative ways of being Spanish. Isabella wanted one way, her way, and she was prepared to use whatever methods necessary to achieve it. The Inquisition became her tool for social engineering on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. Now, about that underwear. The legend goes that Isabella vowed never to change her undergarments until Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, fell to Christian forces. This wasn't a statement about personal hygiene, though the practical implications were undoubtedly challenging. It was a political declaration wrapped in the language of religious devotion. Isabella was announcing to her subjects, her enemies, and history itself that she would accept no compromise in her vision of a unified Christian Spain. The Reconquista had been going on for centuries. Previous Christian monarchs had been content to nibble around the edges of Muslim territory, capturing a city here, a fortress there, then consolidating their gains, and maybe writing some poetry about their glorious victories. Isabella looked at this gradualist approach and decided it lacked ambition. She wanted Granada, and she wanted it yesterday. The war for Granada began in 1482 and lasted a decade. This wasn't the romanticized medieval warfare of knights in shining armor charging across flowery fields. This was systematic, brutal, modern warfare designed to break the will of an entire civilization. Isabella didn't just want to conquer Granada, she wanted to make it impossible for Muslim Spain to ever rise again. She revolutionized military logistics, creating supply lines that could maintain armies in the field for months at a time. She pioneered the use of artillery in siege warfare, importing cannons and gunpowder specialists from across Europe. Most importantly, she understood that winning a war required not just military victory but economic strangulation. She cut off Granada's trade routes, isolated its cities, and systematically destroyed its agricultural base. The siege of Granada itself was less a battle than a demonstration of overwhelming force. Isabella didn't storm the city walls. She built a permanent camp outside them and waited. She constructed what amounted to a small city, complete with markets, churches, and administrative buildings. The message was clear: we're not going anywhere, and we have all the time in the world. You don't. Meanwhile, those undergarments were becoming a topic of considerable interest throughout the royal court. Courtiers, who had nothing better to do than speculate about royal bodily functions, debated the practical implications of the Queen's vow. How exactly does one maintain basic hygiene while making a political point? What were the laundry protocols? Did the vow apply to all undergarments or just specific items? These were the kinds of questions that occupied the medieval mind when not contemplating theology or warfare. The answer, according to contemporary accounts, was that Isabella took her vow seriously enough to endure considerable personal discomfort while maintaining enough practical flexibility to avoid actual health hazards. Medieval underwear wasn't what we might imagine anyway. We're talking about linen shifts and chemises, garments that served more as barriers between body and outer clothing than as the structured undergarments of later eras. Still, wearing the same linen against your skin for months at a time, while conducting military campaigns in the Spanish heat, required dedication to one's political theatre. Granada finally surrendered on January 2, 1492, and Isabella could finally address her laundry situation. More importantly, she had achieved something unprecedented: the complete political and religious unification of the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule. The last Muslim kingdom in Western Europe had fallen, ending nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence in Spain. But Isabella wasn't finished. Having unified Spain through conquest and religious persecution, she now needed to figure out what to do with her new kingdom. This is where the story takes a turn that would reshape not just Spain, but the entire world. Christopher Columbus had been shopping his westward voyage idea around European courts for years. The man was convinced, based on his reading of Marco Polo and his own miscalculations about the size of the earth, that sailing west would provide a shorter route to the spice markets of Asia. Most experts thought he was either crazy or incompetent at basic mathematics. They were half right. Isabella, however, saw potential in Columbus's proposal, not because she believed his geographical theories, which were largely nonsense, but because she understood the strategic value of opening new trade routes. Spain had just spent a decade's worth of royal treasury on the Granada campaign. The kingdom was unified but broke. New sources of revenue weren't just desirable, they were essential for maintaining the political structure Isabella had created. The agreement between Columbus and the Spanish crown was remarkably generous to the explorer. He would be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea and governor of any lands he discovered. He would receive 10% of all precious metals found in new territories. In exchange, Spain would get everything else: the trade routes, the territorial claims, and whatever wealth lay beyond the western horizon. Nobody expected him to find 2 entire continents. Columbus's first voyage in 1492 was a small affair: 3 ships and about 90 men, setting off into the unknown with provisions for what Columbus estimated would be a 5-week journey to Asia, when they instead encountered Caribbean islands populated by people who had never seen Europeans, horses, or steel weapons. Everyone involved realized they were no longer playing by the established rules of international relations. Isabella's response to news of Columbus's discoveries reveals everything you need to know about her character. She didn't celebrate the achievement or marvel at the exotic nature of the new lands. She immediately began planning how to organize, govern, and profit from them. Within months of Columbus's return, she was issuing detailed instructions about the treatment of indigenous populations, the establishment of colonial governments, and the extraction of precious metals. The papal bull Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, divided the newly discovered world between Spain and Portugal. This wasn't negotiation or international law as we understand it. This was simple assertion of Christian European supremacy over everyone else on the planet. Isabella had convinced the Pope that Spain's recent success in religious unification qualified it to extend that unification to whatever lay beyond the Atlantic. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for indigenous American populations. Spanish conquistadors, operating under Isabella's authority and legal framework, began a systematic campaign of conquest, enslavement, and cultural destruction that would continue for centuries. The wealth they extracted, particularly silver from the mines of Potosi, would make Spain the dominant European power for the next century and fundamentally alter the global economy. Isabella established the encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from indigenous communities in exchange for providing military protection and Christian instruction. In practice, this meant legalized slavery with religious justification. The Queen, who had spent years creating religious unity in Spain, was now exporting that same brutal uniformity to an entirely different continent. The irony is that Isabella, who had expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain in the name of religious purity, was now overseeing the forced conversion of millions of people she had never seen, and whose existence she had been unaware of just a few years earlier. The Spanish Inquisition, originally designed to root out religious deviation within Spain, expanded its operations to the New World, where it would continue the work of cultural destruction that Spanish military forces had begun. But let's return to Spain itself, where Isabella's domestic policies were reshaping European civilization. The expulsion of Jews in 1492 announced just months after Granada's fall, wasn't just religious persecution, it was economic warfare against an entire community. Spanish Jews had been integral to the kingdom's commercial and intellectual life for centuries. They served as merchants, scholars, physicians, and financial advisors. Isabella's decision to expel them represented a massive transfer of wealth and knowledge out of Spain. The Edict of Expulsion gave Spanish Jews 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the country forever. They could take no gold or silver with them. They had to sell their property at whatever prices they could get in a saturated market, where everyone knew they had no choice but to sell. Contemporary estimates suggest that between 150,000 and 200,000 people left Spain, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge, commercial contacts, and capital. Many Spanish Jews ended up in the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed by sultans who understood that Spain's loss was their gain. Others went to Portugal, the Netherlands, or North Africa. Wherever they went, they took Spanish commercial techniques, language, and culture with them, creating a global Sephardic diaspora that would last for centuries. Isabella had succeeded in creating religious unity in Spain, but at the cost of severely weakening the kingdom's long-term economic prospects. The expulsion of Muslims, completed in the early 16th century under Isabella's successors, had similar effects. Spanish Muslims had developed sophisticated irrigation techniques, agricultural practices, and architectural styles adapted to the Iberian climate. Their departure left entire regions underpopulated and economically devastated. The Christian settlers who replaced them often lacked the specialized knowledge needed to maintain the complex agricultural systems they inherited. Isabella's religious policies weren't just about spiritual unity, they were about creating a new kind of European state based on ethnic and religious homogeneity. This model would influence European political development for centuries, providing a template for the nationalist movements that would reshape the continent in later eras. The idea that political legitimacy required cultural uniformity, that a kingdom needed one people, one faith, and one language, originated in large part with Isabella's vision of Spanish unity. The economic consequences of these policies became apparent within a generation. The massive influx of American silver that began in the 1520s created inflation throughout Europe, but particularly in Spain, where prices rose faster than productivity. The Spanish economy became addicted to precious metal imports while failing to develop the manufacturing and commercial capabilities that would sustain long-term prosperity. This is what economists call the resource curse, and Spain was among its earliest victims. Isabella died in 1504, having ruled Castile for 30 years. Her marriage to Ferdinand had produced 5 children, including Joanna, who would inherit the throne and bring with her a husband from the powerful Habsburg dynasty. This marriage alliance would make Spain part of a vast European empire that included Austria, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany and Italy. Isabella's unified Spain would become the foundation for the first truly global empire in human history. But the personal cost of Isabella's achievements was enormous. Her vow about her underwear, remembered today as a colourful historical footnote, represented the kind of single-minded determination that shaped her entire reign. She subordinated everything, including basic physical comfort, to her political objectives. Her marriage to Ferdinand was a strategic alliance that happened to work out personally. Her treatment of her children was designed to advance Spanish interests rather than their individual happiness. Her daughter Joanna suffered from what contemporary sources described as melancholy, but which modern historians recognize as serious mental illness. Isabella's response was to use Joanna's condition as a justification for maintaining royal control over succession. When Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Habsburg, Isabella made sure the marriage contracts protected Spanish interests, even if her daughter proved incapable of ruling effectively. Isabella's son John died young, possibly from the physical demands of his marriage to Margaret of Austria, which had been arranged to cement the Spanish-Habsburg alliance. Her daughter Catherine became Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry V of England, and her failure to produce a male heir would eventually trigger the English Reformation and England's break with Rome. Even Isabella's children's failures served larger historical purposes. The Queen's personal religious devotion was genuine, but it was also politically calculated. her patronage of religious institutions, her support for missionary activities in the New World, and her establishment of the Inquisition all served to legitimize royal authority through religious sanction. Isabella understood that in an age when political power required divine approval, being seen as God's chosen instrument was more valuable than military force or economic resources. Her approach to governance was remarkably modern in some respects and thoroughly medieval in others. She created bureaucratic institutions that would outlast her reign, established legal codes that provided consistency across her territories, and pioneered administrative techniques that would be adopted throughout Europe. At the same time, she maintained the fiction that royal authority derived from divine appointment and that religious orthodoxy was essential for political stability. The Spanish Empire that emerged from Isabella's reign would dominate global politics for the next century. Spanish gold and silver would finance European wars. Spanish missionaries would spread Christianity to 4 continents, and Spanish culture would influence civilizations from the Philippines to Peru. But the empire's foundations were deeply problematic, based as they were on the systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples, the extraction of natural resources without sustainable development, and the maintenance of religious and ethnic homogeneity through violence. Isabella's legacy is thus paradoxical. She created the political unity that made Spanish greatness possible, but she also established the patterns of intolerance and exploitation that would ultimately limit that greatness. Her vision of religious and cultural uniformity succeeded in the short term, but proved economically and socially destructive in the long term. Her commitment to expanding Christianity brought European civilization to the New World, but also brought European diseases, slavery, and cultural destruction to millions of people. The question of her underwear, which seemed so important during the Granada campaign, ultimately symbolizes something larger about Isabella's approach to leadership. She was willing to sacrifice personal comfort, individual liberty, and even economic rationality for the sake of political objectives she considered essential. This kind of single-minded determination can achieve remarkable things in the short term, but it often comes at costs that become apparent only later. Modern Spain still grapples with Isabella's legacy. The country's regional diversity, suppressed but never eliminated by her unification policies, reasserted itself in the 20th century and continues to shape Spanish politics today. The wealth extracted from the Americas ultimately benefited other European powers more than Spain itself, as Spanish silver financed Dutch and English economic development, while Spanish industry remained underdeveloped. The Inquisition, Isabella's tool for enforcing religious orthodoxy, became a symbol of intolerance and fanaticism that damaged Spain's reputation throughout Europe. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims, intended to create religious unity, weakened Spanish society and contributed to the kingdom's long-term economic decline. Even Isabella's greatest military achievement, the conquest of Granada, proved Pyrrhic in the long run, as the resources devoted to maintaining control over a hostile population might have been better invested in economic development. Yet Isabella's achievements remain extraordinary by any measure. She transformed a collection of feuding kingdoms into a unified state, established the foundation for the first global empire, and fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe and the world. She proved that a woman could exercise political authority as effectively as any man, even in an era when female rule was considered unnatural and dangerous. Her marriage to Ferdinand created a partnership that combined personal affection with political calculation in ways that benefited both individuals and their kingdoms. The story of Isabella's underwear, whether literally true or simply a symbol of her determination, captures something essential about the nature of political leadership. Great historical achievements often require personal sacrifices that seem trivial in retrospect, but were enormously significant to the people making them. Isabella's willingness to endure personal discomfort for the sake of political theatre demonstrates the kind of commitment that separates successful leaders from those who merely occupy positions of authority. Her understanding of the relationship between personal behaviour and political legitimacy was remarkably sophisticated. In an era when royal authority depended heavily on public perception, Isabella grasped that symbolic gestures could be as important as military victories or economic policies. Her vow about her underwear was intended to demonstrate her commitment to the Granada campaign, but it also served to distinguish her from previous monarchs who had been content with partial victories and compromise solutions. The 10-year campaign for Granada required sustained public support and enormous financial resources. Isabella's personal vow helped maintain enthusiasm for what was essentially a war of choice rather than necessity. Granada posed no immediate threat to Castile. The Muslim kingdom could have been contained indefinitely with far less effort and expense. But containment wasn't enough for Isabella. She wanted complete victory, and she understood that complete victory required the kind of total commitment that could only be demonstrated through personal sacrifice. This pattern of total commitment extended to every aspect of Isabella's reign. She didn't simply want to govern Castile. She wanted to transform it into something unprecedented in European history. She didn't just want to defeat her enemies. She wanted to eliminate them entirely. She didn't just want to spread Christianity. She wanted to create a world where alternatives to Christianity could not exist. This maximalist approach had enormous consequences, both positive and negative. It made possible the rapid conquest of the Americas, the creation of the first truly global empire, and the spread of European civilization to previously unknown continents. It also made inevitable the destruction of indigenous American civilizations, the establishment of slavery on an industrial scale, and the creation of racial hierarchies that would persist for centuries. Isabella's personal religious devotion was genuine, but it was also shaped by the political requirements of her position. Medieval queens were expected to be pious, but Isabella took religious observance to extremes that served political as well as spiritual purposes. Her daily attendance at multiple religious services, her generous patronage of religious institutions, and her consultation with religious advisors on political matters all helped establish her legitimacy as a ruler chosen by God. The Spanish Inquisition, established under Isabella's authority, was simultaneously a religious institution and a political tool. Its primary function was to identify and eliminate religious deviation, but it also served to strengthen royal authority by creating a bureaucratic apparatus that answered directly to the crown rather than to local nobles or church authorities. The Inquisition's methods were brutal, but its efficiency in gathering information and maintaining social control made it an effective instrument of state power. Isabella's treatment of sexual morality was similarly calculated. She maintained strict personal standards while tolerating the inevitable compromises required by political reality. Her marriage to Ferdinand was sexually successful by medieval standards, producing 5 children who survived to adulthood. But she also understood that royal sexuality was inherently political, and she used her personal conduct to reinforce broader messages about Spanish values and Christian virtue. The question of whether Isabella actually wore the same undergarments for 10 years, or whether this was simply a political fiction designed to demonstrate her commitment, ultimately misses the point. What matters is that she understood the power of symbolic gestures in maintaining public support for difficult political projects. Her vow, whether literally fulfilled or not, became part of the mythology surrounding the Granada campaign and helped sustain Spanish morale during a long and expensive war. Isabella's death in 1504 marked the end of an era in Spanish history. Her daughter Joanna, who inherited the throne, proved incapable of effective rule, leading to a regency period and eventually the accession of Isabella's grandson, the future Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. The unified Spain that Isabella had created would become part of a vast European empire, but it would never again be governed by a ruler as single-mindedly devoted to Spanish interests as Isabella had been. The transformation of Spain from a collection of medieval kingdoms into a unified modern state was Isabella's greatest achievement, but it came at enormous cost. The wealth extracted from the Americas made Spain temporarily powerful, but ultimately weak, as Spanish society became addicted to imported wealth, while failing to develop the economic and social institutions necessary for sustained prosperity. The religious and ethnic homogeneity Isabella imposed created short-term stability, but long-term rigidity, as Spain became increasingly isolated from the intellectual and economic developments that were transforming the rest of Europe. Isabella's legacy thus embodies the contradictions of early modern European civilization. Her reign demonstrated the potential for rapid political and social transformation through the application of sustained will and effective organization. It also demonstrated the dangers of pursuing political objectives without regard for their long-term consequences or their impact on the people who bear their costs. The queen who never changed her underwear until Granada fell became a symbol of determination and political will that transcended the specific circumstances of her reign. Her story illustrates the ways in which personal commitment and symbolic gestures can shape historical outcomes, but it also reveals the limitations of individual agency in the face of larger historical forces. Isabella could create a unified Spain and launch the conquest of the Americas, but she could not control the long-term consequences of the forces she unleashed. In the end, Isabella's reign represents one of those pivotal moments in history when individual decisions and collective forces combined to reshape the world in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. Her personal determination and political skill made possible achievements that would have been inconceivable under a less committed ruler. But the very qualities that made her successful also made her dangerous, as her willingness to sacrifice everything for her political objectives created patterns of intolerance and exploitation that would persist long after her death. The story of Isabella's underwear, whether literally true or simply symbolic, captures something essential about the relationship between personal commitment and political achievement. Great historical transformations often require leaders who are willing to subordinate every aspect of their lives to their political objectives. Isabella was such a leader, and the consequences of her total commitment continue to shape our world today. But there's another dimension to Isabella's story that deserves attention: the sheer audacity of what she attempted and achieved. Consider the scale of her ambitions. She didn't just want to rule Castile effectively, she wanted to create something that had never existed before. A unified Spanish state wasn't just politically difficult in the 15th century, it was conceptually revolutionary. The idea that diverse populations with different languages, traditions, and loyalties could be welded into a single political entity went against everything medieval Europe understood about governance and social organization. Medieval political theory assumed that different peoples required different laws and customs. The notion of uniform legal codes, standardized administrative procedures, and centralized authority was alien to a world where local variation was considered natural and necessary. Isabella's vision of Spanish unity thus represented a fundamental challenge to established political thought, and implementing it required not just military force, but intellectual innovation on an unprecedented scale. The administrative machinery Isabella created to govern unified Spain was remarkably sophisticated for its time. She established royal councils with specific jurisdictions, created standardized procedures for tax collection and military recruitment, and developed communication systems that allowed central authority to reach into previously autonomous regions. These innovations would later influence political development throughout Europe, as other monarchs adopted Spanish administrative techniques to strengthen their own kingdoms. But the human cost of creating this administrative efficiency was enormous. Traditional local elites, who had governed their regions for generations according to customary law and established privilege, found themselves displaced by royal appointees who owed their positions to the crown rather than to local connections. Ancient urban councils, which had negotiated directly with previous monarchs as equals, discovered that Isabella expected obedience rather than consultation. Regional assemblies that had maintained independent authority for centuries were reduced to ceremonial bodies with no real power. The resistance to these changes was substantial and sustained. Noble rebellions continued throughout Isabella's reign, not because Spanish aristocrats were inherently rebellious, but because royal unification threatened their fundamental interests and traditional ways of life. Each uprising was suppressed with increasing severity, as Isabella learned that halfway measures only encouraged further resistance. By the end of her reign, the Spanish nobility had been effectively neutered as an independent political force, transformed from autonomous lords into court dependents whose wealth and status depended entirely on royal favor. This transformation of noble power had profound social consequences. Traditional feudal relationships, which had provided stability and predictability for centuries, were replaced by bureaucratic hierarchies that operated according to royal preference rather than customary obligation. Peasants who had previously dealt with familiar local lords now confronted distant royal officials who had no personal connection to their communities. Urban merchants who had negotiated with known municipal authorities found themselves subject to regulations imposed by administrators they had never seen. The psychological impact of these changes was as significant as their political effects. Isabella's Spain was the first European society to experience what we might recognize as modern state power: comprehensive, impersonal, and inescapable. Previous monarchs had been powerful but distant figures who intervened in local affairs only occasionally, and usually for specific purposes. Isabella's government was present everywhere, all the time, monitoring, regulating, and controlling aspects of daily life that had previously been considered private or local matters. Religious conformity was just one aspect of this broader transformation. The Spanish Inquisition's investigations into personal belief and private conduct represented a new kind of governmental intrusion into individual consciousness. Medieval Christians had always been expected to conform to official doctrine, but the Inquisition systematized and bureaucratized the enforcement of orthodoxy in ways that made dissent effectively impossible. The institution created detailed records of interrogations, maintained extensive networks of informants, and developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and eliminating religious deviation. The economic implications of Isabella's policies extended far beyond the immediate costs of military campaigns and administrative expansion. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims didn't just remove religious minorities. It eliminated entire economic networks that had connected Spanish markets to the broader Mediterranean economy. Jewish merchants had maintained commercial relationships throughout Europe and the Islamic world, providing Spanish producers with access to distant markets and exotic goods. Muslim artisans had preserved technical knowledge and manufacturing techniques that Spanish Christians had never fully mastered. The replacement of these expelled populations with Christian settlers was never entirely successful. Many of the agricultural techniques developed by Spanish Muslims required generations of accumulated knowledge and experience that couldn't be quickly transferred to new populations. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair, specialized crops were abandoned, and entire regions experienced economic decline that persisted for centuries. The immediate religious and political benefits of expulsion were achieved at the cost of long-term economic weakness that would handicap Spanish development for generations. Isabella's colonial policies in the Americas amplified these problems on a global scale. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonist control over indigenous labor and tribute, was designed to reward conquistadors while generating revenue for the crown. In practice, it created a colonial economy based on the extraction of precious metals and agricultural products, rather than the development of manufacturing or sustainable agriculture. This extractive model would characterize Spanish colonial rule for 3 centuries and contribute to the underdevelopment of Latin American economies that persists today. The massive influx of American silver that began in the 1520s transformed not just Spanish but global economics. The sudden increase in precious metal supplies created inflation throughout Europe, but Spain bore the brunt of this price revolution because Spanish society became addicted to imported wealth rather than developing productive capacity. Spanish nobles used American silver to purchase luxury goods manufactured in other European countries, inadvertently financing the industrial development of Spain's competitors, while Spanish manufacturing remained primitive and inefficient. This pattern of resource extraction without productive investment became a characteristic feature of Spanish economic policy. The Crown's share of American precious metals financed military campaigns and administrative expansion, rather than infrastructure development or industrial innovation. Spanish universities, which had been among Europe's finest during the medieval period, declined as royal patronage focused on military and religious rather than intellectual priorities. Spanish cities, which had been centers of commercial innovation during the early medieval period, became administrative centers focused on tax collection and military recruitment rather than productive economic activity. The irony is that Isabella's success in creating political unity made Spain less adaptable to changing economic circumstances. The centralized administrative apparatus she created was remarkably effective at mobilizing resources for specific royal objectives, but it was poorly designed to respond to market signals or encourage private initiative. Spanish merchants and manufacturers operated within a regulatory framework designed to serve royal interests, rather than promote economic efficiency, making it difficult for Spanish producers to compete with their counterparts in more decentralized European economies. Isabella's influence on European gender relations was equally profound, though more subtle than her political and economic impacts. Her successful exercise of royal authority challenged prevailing assumptions about female capacity for leadership, but she accomplished this without explicitly challenging patriarchal norms. Instead, she presented her rule as an exceptional circumstance, justified by divine appointment and political necessity rather than as evidence of general female competence. This strategy was politically astute but historically limiting. Isabella's example inspired other European women to seek political power, but it didn't create a framework for understanding female authority as normal rather than exceptional. Subsequent female rulers would face the same challenges Isabella had confronted, without the benefit of institutional changes that might have made female leadership more acceptable to European society. Isabella's marriage to Ferdinand represented a new model of royal partnership that influenced European court culture for generations. Previous royal marriages had typically been either strategic alliances with minimal personal connection or passionate relationships that ignored political considerations. Isabella and Ferdinand managed to combine genuine affection with calculated political cooperation, creating a template for successful dynastic marriages that would be emulated throughout Europe. But this marriage model also reinforced certain assumptions about gender roles that would prove limiting for future generations. Isabella's authority was always understood to be complementary to rather than independent of Ferdinand's, and their partnership worked precisely because both spouses accepted traditional gender hierarchies, even while operating outside them in practice. This created a paradox that would complicate European discussions of female authority. For centuries, women could rule effectively, but only within frameworks that ultimately reinforced male supremacy. The cultural impact of Isabella's reign extended throughout the Spanish-speaking world and beyond. The Spanish language, literature, and artistic traditions that emerged during her reign would influence global culture for centuries. Spanish became the language of administration throughout the Americas, creating linguistic unity across a continent that facilitated communication and cultural exchange. Spanish legal codes, based on Roman law, but modified to reflect Isabella's centralizing vision, became the foundation for legal systems throughout Latin America. Spanish religious architecture, literature, and music reflected the intense Catholicism that Isabella promoted, creating distinctive cultural forms that combined medieval Christian traditions with influences absorbed from Muslim and Jewish sources during the centuries of coexistence that preceded Isabella's unification policies. The paradox is that Isabella's efforts to eliminate religious and cultural diversity actually preserved and transformed elements from the traditions she sought to destroy. A Spanish Christian culture incorporated techniques and perspectives it had absorbed from the communities it displaced. The global spread of Spanish culture through colonization created the first truly worldwide cultural system, connecting Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas through shared languages, legal traditions, and religious practices. This cultural unification had profound consequences for global development, creating communication networks and institutional similarities that facilitated trade and cultural exchange, while also imposing European norms on populations that had developed their own sophisticated civilizations. Isabella's death in 1504 came at a moment when the full implications of her policies were just becoming apparent. The Americas were revealing their enormous extent and wealth. Religious unification had been achieved, but at the cost of economic vitality, and Spanish political unity was secure, but potentially brittle. Her immediate successors would inherit both the opportunities and the problems she had created, without necessarily possessing her political skills or single-minded determination. The Regency period that followed Isabella's death revealed some of the weaknesses built into the system she had created. Centralized authority worked effectively when exercised by a competent and determined monarch, but it provided few mechanisms for maintaining stability when royal authority was weak or disputed. Joanna's mental instability created a succession crisis that could have destroyed Spanish unity, and only the intervention of foreign Habsburg power prevented the fragmentation of Isabella's unified kingdom. The eventual accession of Charles V, Isabella's grandson, marked the transformation of Spain from a unified kingdom into the center of a global empire. Charles inherited not just Isabella's Spanish territories, but also vast Habsburg possessions in Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands, creating a political entity that stretched across Europe and the Americas. This expansion magnified both the strengths and the weaknesses of the system Isabella had created, as Spanish administrative techniques and colonial policies were applied on an unprecedented scale. The long-term consequences of Isabella's reign thus extended far beyond Spain itself. The pattern of religious intolerance she established in Spain was exported to other parts of Europe through Spanish political influence and Habsburg dynastic connections. The colonial techniques pioneered in the Americas were adapted for use in other European overseas territories. The administrative innovations developed for Spanish unification influenced governmental development throughout Europe. But Isabella's most lasting legacy may be the demonstration that rapid, comprehensive political and social transformation was possible through the application of sustained political will backed by effective organization. Her reign proved that traditional institutions and cultural practices, no matter how ancient or deeply rooted, could be transformed or eliminated through systematic effort. This lesson would be absorbed by subsequent European rulers and would influence political development for centuries. The story of Isabella's underwear, whether literally accurate or simply symbolic, thus represents something larger about the nature of political transformation. Comprehensive change requires leaders willing to sacrifice everything, including personal comfort and individual preferences, for their political objectives. Isabella's willingness to endure personal discomfort for the sake of political theatre demonstrates the kind of total commitment that makes historical transformation possible. Her reign also illustrates the double-edged nature of such commitment. The same determination that made possible the unification of Spain and the creation of the first global empire also made inevitable the destruction of religious and cultural diversity, the exploitation of indigenous populations, and the establishment of patterns of intolerance that would persist for centuries. Isabella's achievements and failures thus offer enduring lessons about the possibilities and dangers of ambitious political leadership in any era.